Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here with us today. This is one in a series of engagement events being led by the Inclusive Economy Workstream of the VCSE Accord. And today we are considering the question together, could our new government deliver a fairer economy? So my name's Dawn Yates-Obe. I'm Chief Executive of Bolton CVS, that's a local infrastructure organisation in Bolton, and also a Director of 10GM. And I will introduce you to our two speakers today and explain a little bit about what the question that they're each considering in a moment, and also do a bit of kind of housekeeping that I'm sure we're all familiar with in this online world that we're all so comfortable in now. So if you could keep yourselves on mute, that would be lovely if you're not speaking. After our guest speakers, we have time for questions. If you have a question, you can use the chat function, or you can raise your hand if you'd like to say your question. We'll look through those in the chat first, and then we'll come to people who may have a question that they want to verbalise. So there'll be time for that at the end, and we will close with a quick poll and be done by or shortly before 3 o'clock. So firstly, I'm going to introduce John Hannen, who is the Chief Executive of GMCVO. And John is going to share some of his observations and thinking of our new government's plan for growth and what this might mean for creating an inclusive economy here in Greater Manchester. And then John will hand over to Graham Whitam, who is the Chief Executive of Resolve Poverty, which some of you may know as in its former name of the GM Poverty Action. And Graham will consider the potential impact of this change in government on people and our communities in Greater Manchester. So just as a reminder, keep yourselves on mute if you're not speaking. Pop any questions that John and Graham will do their very best to answer towards the end of the session into the chat, or you can put your hand up. And just to note that this session is being recorded, and we will share that recording and any other materials with you all following the session. Okay, over to you, John.
Thanks, Dawn. So I'm just getting my slideshow up now. Unfortunately, I'm having to do this myself, so I can't say next slide, please, which I usually enjoy. There's always a moment while I attempt to find the button. There we go. So that should have the slide on screen now, and Dawn can give me a thumbs up or thumbs down. There we go. Right, so there's the exam question. What's the government's plan for growth, and what might this mean for creating an inclusive economy in Greater Manchester? Well, will the government create a new economy? I mean, I don't like to do murder mysteries in my presentation, so I'm just giving you a sense of what I'm going to be talking about. It depends. It's not a clear-cut answer. Also, because we don't have all the information yet. The government's announced its first set of bits of legislation. It made a financial statement on Monday, but there's no budget yet in place. And the budget is going to show us its priorities and where it wants to put money and where it wants to reduce money. I think it's really important to understand that the government is constrained. It's not got the ability to do everything it might want to do. Some of those are imposed by the circumstances we're in and by other forces. Some of those the government has chosen itself. So the government can actually free itself from some of those restrictions, but it's going to have to break some commitments to do that, and it's reluctant to do so. So there's going to be some positives and negatives, so it's not going to be a kind of a clear thumbs up or thumbs down, yes or no to this answer. So if I think about what are the factors in influencing economic growth at the moment, it's a bit of a cheap shot, but Liz Truss. I think it's really important to think about what happened when Liz Truss was Prime Minister. Liz Truss had a plan for growth, and that growth was to stimulate the economy. And she put a lot of unfunded spending in place, and the markets thought that's going to increase inflation. That means the Bank of England's going to increase interest rates, and it acted accordingly, and the rest is history. So I think we've got to recognise that the traditional way that governments stimulate the economy is just pumping money into it. But you can't do that at the moment because of the inflation pressures and the cost of living we've seen. So the balance, the levers the government has got for growth, it's got to balance out. So spending can create growth if you spend it in the right places, just putting money into the economy. Taxation can impact on growth. You reduce taxes, that puts more money into the economy. You increase taxes, it dampens down the economy. So when sometimes you hear about spending needs to be costed, it's not like a budget where you've got to raise the money to spend it. You've got to balance the stimulation of the economy with the things that dampen it down. But it's not just about tax and spend that generate growth. You've got to think about the other forces as well. Labour markets. After we left the European Union, we were cut off from a lot of labour markets. And that meant that we had a lot of job vacancies we couldn't fill. And the price of wages and the price of labour went up, and that's inflationary. And it also reduces growth. So if we could create another 2 million workers in the economy now, that would create a real boost to growth. But there's other policies as well, trade policies. If goods are more expensive in the economy, then that can have an impact on growth and inflation. So it's not all about making the tax balance the spend. You've got to look at those other areas such as labour markets and trade and the other things that can generate growth or kind of dampen down inflation that allow you to then get on with the spending. So the government's going to be quite cautious about balancing these, because if we get another dose of inflation and interest rates go up again, that's going to be quite bad, both for business and for people in terms of mortgage rates, but also can businesses grow? Can they get the money investment in to grow? So there's a lot of nervousness still about inflation. Even though inflation is on target, we still have high interest rates, and the government's quite worried. So how the government's intending to generate growth, it's really interesting when you try and find out. There's a lot of political commentators and economists saying they don't know how the government's going to create the growth it wants to create. But these seem to be the main factors it's looking at. Being stable, just by being stable and being predictable, can get a lot of investment into the country. The government's trying to say is, in this crazy mixed up world with things going on in other countries and the elections in France, and you see some of the things that have been close by, and also in the United States this year, the UK being stable and having a stable government that's not in chaos means the UK is a good place to do work, and that might draw in some money. They're being clear that they want to be the place that's good for investors, that investors want to go to. That can generate some growth in terms of, we're listening to you, we'll make sure regulations help you and fit you. They're also looking at local growth plans, and this is an interesting change in terms of, rather than just saying we'll do some tweaks at a national level, really saying to mayors and like our own mayor and the city region, come up with a growth plan and we'll back you. So it's going to be much more, some of it's going to be much more local. They want to increase the size of the labour market. They're looking at the number. I think we're up to about 5 million people who are economically inactive. So it's people who might be of working age but aren't in work, are looking for work. They might have barriers to employment. They might have care responsibilities. They might have ill health. They might have a range of things that stop them from engaging in work. So how do you help those people who might want work but have barriers to work to get into work? Labour market reforms could be quite important. This could be quite complex, and one of the problems we've got is the UK has a really bad labour market with lots of bad jobs that are poorly paid, but also don't generate much growth. The best example of this, if you go back 30 years, if you wanted to wash your car, you went to a garage and you put a token in a machine and you washed it yourself. And now we have these car parking sites where 6 people will wash your car for you. That doesn't feel like progress. It's lots of people on very low wages rather than a maintenance engineer on a decent wage fixing some machines. So our economy's gone backwards in the quality of the jobs it generates. So the Labour government talking about improved employment rights will damage a number of employers who create bad jobs and might leave the space for good jobs to be created. And there's 800,000 vacancies in the economy at the moment we're carrying. So there's a demand for people to do work that's skilled and will be better paying. But those people trapped in bad jobs and some of the bad employers who undercut good employers are part of the problem, and that may change. And the other thing is, when we've yet to see any of this or whether it's possible, just by making things a bit smoother in terms of our work with the EU, So that reduces the friction at the borders. That might reduce the cost of goods, might enable trade, and that can create growth as well. So there's no clear plan, but there's those things that we know they're levers they're trying to pull. The big changes that have been announced and the King's speech and the big bills, these are the five I picked out that won't make a change tomorrow, but may make a change over time. So the first two, National Wealth Fund and Great British Energy Bill, they're combined. There's £7 billion going to be put on the table. They think that can bring in £21 billion of investment to go into new energy generation. And that idea of creating a new industry around clean energy and sustainable energy will create jobs, will create work, and that's going to be a big issue for them. But also reduce our dependence on Russian gas and energy security, and also have the prices of energy go down because we're more self-sufficient on generating energy. The planning and infrastructure bill, which will be quite controversial in some places, is going to be make it easy to build stuff. But it's also going to be getting rid of some of the barriers. But that's going to be controversial if people are against planning in their local area. But it's also going to give some really key targets for local government in terms of house building and so on. They really want to get that going. The employment rights bill, as I said, people have been worried that it's been watered down, but it will still increase employment rights and it will reduce the ability of employers to undercut people on bad work. So that's going to be a major issue. It will take time to consult and put that in place. A big one, the English devolution bill. I think the government is genuine about wanting to place more power to local areas. Part of that is to local areas know where the growth opportunities are in place, know what the barriers are in place, can do something to fix it. That's the positive side. I think we've also got to be aware of the government try to pass the buck on to local government and try to devolve the blame as well as the power. So we just got to see how that goes. So there is the structural stuff that will change the way the economy works, but that isn't necessarily some of the inclusive stuff. It's just standard stuff that we might have seen a few years ago. So in Greater Manchester, where's the policy like to be? So linking health and growth is going to be really important. So just to give you some stats, there's about 65,000 people who are currently unemployed at the moment and seeking employment. But we've got about 85,000 people who are economically inactive, who aren't looking for work, but who would quite like a job, but they've got barriers in the way. So actually dealing with care responsibilities, dealing with health issues can actually get more people in work than there are unemployed people at the moment as well. So the link between good health and the ability to work is going to be a real one. And Greater Manchester has high levels of ill health as well. And that causes people to drop out of employment. And this becomes a growth and an economy issue. Greater Manchester has also highlighted some key growth locations. Some of the ones that are going to be obvious, like Trafford Park, City Centre, but they're also trying to look for areas outside the core and into the periphery. There's one called Atom Valley, which is a kind of, I think it's towards the Rochdale Oldham area, where they try to say, well, can we create new high-tech industries there? Can we get government to kind of push some research and some work into that place and create a new kind of business there? So those growth locations could create jobs that are close to people and a good standard. Although just because you want them to turn up doesn't mean they're going to be the ones who want to take up the space and the land and the sites. And there's always the risk that you just get more Amazon warehouses in those growth locations. So that's the bit where there's some level of risk. Working with universities to create innovation and technology, and those using the kind of skills and talent and the Graphene Institute in Greater Manchester, all that stuff is in that plan. But as I say, that's not necessarily for the whole economy and whole geography at any point in time. But these things can create tent poles, which can create other kinds of industries below them. I think a key element is the transport network. If you're creating jobs in these locations, can people get access to them? At the moment, it's easier to get access to the city centre than it is to go from district to district on those kind of orbital routes. And so improved transport that helps people get to these diverse locations across are going to be important. But the question with all of that is that doesn't necessarily create inclusive growth in itself. That might create better jobs, but who owns these businesses? Who's in control of them? And how are we creating kind of locally owned businesses that keep the profits into Greater Manchester rather than just taking them outside? So although this has the potential to create growth, it's the kind of old models of growth and traditional models of growth. So that sense of something a bit more inclusive is missing a bit there. So if I'm just going to give a summary of this, the government is trying to govern in the way it campaigned. People were saying the Labour Party were quite cautious in their election campaign. They've not just ripped the mask off and decided that they're a different kind of organisation now. It's still been quite cautious. It's set off with some limited ambitions, and it's nervous about the inflation situation at the moment. And we should all be to a certain degree, but there are ways you can measure this. It's relying on growth to happen to fund services in the future. So it really does want to generate growth and the benefits of those growth will go into public service provision, but there's no clarity in what the plan is over the next year to get the initial bit of growth going. And of course, the nature of the growth. And if you're being a place that's friendly to international investors, then it's kind of economy in their interests rather than some of the more local interests. And also accidents will happen in the meantime because things we don't predict, whether it's pandemics, floods, we have more extreme weather events, things will happen in the meantime. And also, do we really know the state of what a lot of the services are in? People talk about things like prisons being in crisis and the health service. I think the school system and education sector's in real problems, and it's not often in the news all that much. But there are some big structural changes that will take a little bit of a while to get through, but they will be significant, especially around planning and energy. And we shouldn't lose sight of those employment right changes. It's going to be a challenge for some organisations in the voluntary community social enterprise sector if they use things like 0 hours contracts and some of those. But that kind of economic model isn't going to be successful once those employment rights are in place. But that should give an ability to create better jobs, which is certainly not nothing. It's not the same as having local ownership in that we'd kind of look for in terms of inclusive economy, but it will be an improvement. So I think that's the sense of things where you can say, here's some plans to get the economy going, but they're prioritizing getting the economy going in traditional ways with the promise of doing something more interesting later on once they've got the headroom. It's just whether we get to that point or how long it takes to get there that's going to be the issue. So I'll stop sharing there, and I realised that was quite a whistle-stop tour, and I hope that was useful. And I'll hand over to Graham now, who's going to talk about, from his perspective, the impact on people.
Well, thanks, John. So I'll do the same thing as John and just find my slides. Just bear with me a second. So yeah, as Dawn says, so I'm Graham Whitam, Chief Executive of Resolve Poverty, and some of you will have clocked the new name and the rebrand that happened for us a month or so ago. So thanks for all the kind words we've had in response to that. It's been good to have such positive response to the change. So quite a lot of what I'm going to talk about is quite top line, or there's quite a lot of detail underneath a number of the things that I'll touch on as I go through the slides. So, we haven't got time to go into all the detail, but hopefully it'll give you a good understanding of the picture in terms of poverty, what it means for Greater Manchester, and kind of what the incoming Labour government, the new Labour government, means in terms of the poverty agenda and what that means for our residents and communities across the city region. A little bit of just context setting from me at the start, just in terms of policy context. And obviously, in terms of ourselves at Resolve Poverty, we're working locally to end poverty nationally. There's been some good stuff going on in localities across Greater Manchester and across the country to address the poverty crisis that exists in the UK. But it's been in the context or in a vacuum of there being no national leadership on poverty at a UK Westminster government level over the last 14 years. So over the last 14 years, we've not had a meaningful national anti-poverty strategy at any point, driven by the UK government in Westminster. As part of that, localities, so local authorities and partners, they're not required to have local anti-poverty strategies themselves. But as I say, there's been quite a lot of activity at a local level in Greater Manchester and further afield across England in terms of strategic policy and practical responses to poverty. But as I say, acting in a vacuum in terms of not driven by national kind of leadership there. In terms of central government's approach, in terms of responding to kind of needs during the pandemic and cost of living crisis, quite a lot of that has been short-term, so short-term missed approach. And people who are aware of the Household Support Fund, and I think many of you on this call will be, that perhaps embodies the short-termism of the government's approach. So what local authorities and partners have had is short-term funding from central government, usually for 6 months at a time, to respond to the needs of low-income residents in their communities, with no indication as to whether that funding is going to continue. We've also, more of the long term, had this issue with working age benefit cuts, so people will be aware of kind of cuts to the social security system that have happened over the last 14 years. Those cuts really have, and I'll talk a little bit more detail about this in a second, have been very much targeted at working age benefits. We're all quite familiar, I think, with the housing demands as well that we've got both in Greater Manchester and across the country as a whole. So lots of people either homeless or living in temporary accommodation. Large numbers of families, so families with children, find themselves in that situation. More recently, we've had the cost of living crisis. So, and although inflation's come down, it's not like you press a reset when inflation goes back to 2%, that suddenly costs are back to where they were 2 years ago. You know, the essential items, the things that everybody kind of has to spend money on, food, fuel, etc., are much more costly now than they were 2 or 3 years ago, and that's still a big disproportionate impact on low-income households. And then, as John's mentioned, we've got the labour market challenges. So labour market challenges in the UK and in Greater Manchester have been less about unemployment and people experiencing worklessness, but more about people being in work, but being in low quality jobs where they're low paid, limited opportunities for progression, and not necessarily lifting people kind of out of poverty, above the poverty line. Just a bit more context in terms of some of these figures, and I know it's quite unwieldy, this, because there's lots of data out there about sort of levels of poverty in the UK, and you might see different figures being cited. 14.3 million people are living in poverty, relative poverty, after housing costs across the UK as a whole, of which 4.3 million of those are children. So a large proportion of residents in the UK as a whole living in poverty. We've seen a big jump in food insecurity over the last few years as well. So more and more households classed as food insecure, and more children experiencing material deprivation. Sorry, bear with me a second there. So risk of poverty, the other thing just to sort of bear in mind as we go through the later slides is just this risk of poverty. So different groups of the population are more likely to be struggling on a low income than others. So people in rented accommodation, people who are not in work, people from certain ethnic backgrounds, families where someone's disabled, families with 3 or more children, and we'll touch on this a little bit more in a second, and single parent families all have a much heightened risk of poverty. So in terms of those kind of working age benefit cuts, and this is still a little bit of context setting from me, as I mentioned a couple of slides ago, it's really working age families who've been hit by working age benefit cuts. So on average, working age families have lost £1,500 as a result of benefit cuts since 2010. Even higher amounts for certain families. So families with 3 or more children have faced a particularly large hit. And that compares to an average gain of £900 for older people, for pensioners. So not surprisingly, kind of that government focus on the triple lot for pensions over the last 14 years has been in stark contrast to the cuts to working age benefits that we've seen hammer working age families. So in terms of the incoming Labour government and where we're at now, and kind of the positive aspect to this is what we've had from the government in both the manifesto and then since the election in terms of announcements is the sense that they're creating the architecture for a national mission for tackling poverty. So putting poverty on the national policy agenda at Westminster in a way it's not been over the last 14 years. So talking about they've got a commitment to having a child poverty strategy, And there's been some things that have happened since the election to set things going in that respect. So the government's created a task force with external partners to focus on child poverty strategy. We've got the child poverty unit, which is a cross-departmental unit, stood up. And the responsibility for the child poverty strategy will sit across Department for Work and Pensions and Department for Education. And then another thing that we focus on, resolve poverty, is the socio-economic duty. So this is something contained in the Equalities Act 2010 that was never brought into law, so it was never enacted. So if it was enacted, it would require all public bodies to take into account the impact of their decisions on people from low-income backgrounds. So similar to some of the equalities duties that public bodies currently have to adhere to. So there's a commitment in the Labour Party manifesto to bring the socio-economic duty into force. So we feel like those two things are creating the conditions for a genuine focus on poverty at that national level. In terms of kind of the policy side, and John's covered some of these already, kind of 4 areas that I picked out where they're relevant to the kind of poverty agenda and they have the potential to improve things for our communities in Greater Manchester. So we've got the Employment Rights Bill. So that's looking at things like banning exploitative 0-hours contracts, addressing the fire and rehire practices, doing things that will enable greater union recognition and making that easier in workplaces. So really important steps there. The Low Pay Commission, which is the body that sets the national minimum wage and national living wage, has been asked to consider the cost of living in its forthcoming calculation for what the new rate should be, but also look at the age bands that we've got. So people be aware that there's a lower rate and a lower statutory minimum for younger people. They've been asked to look at closing that gap so young people aren't discriminated against as much. Then in terms of early years, obviously early years are really important in terms of improving life chances and addressing social mobility challenges. So there's a big focus on increasing places, which got quite a lot of coverage during the election campaign. So that's really about creating more spaces, nursery spaces in school settings, but also some interventions around sort of improving quality and driving standards within nursery settings as well. And then in terms of housing, the focus has been very much on increasing supply. And that, again, since the election, has been a thing that's perhaps generated most publicity. There's also some things around sort of leasehold reforms and addressing the kind of leasehold challenges that people in privately rented accommodation face. So some potential for positive moves there. So some positive things there, or potential to kind of move things in a positive direction, which will improve the lives, hopefully, of people in Greater Manchester. We've obviously got this challenge in terms of spending constraints, which John talked about. And one of the things that we know is that if we're going to have a national child poverty strategy that's actually going to achieve something and drive down the number of children experiencing poverty across the country, then the government will need to pull some big levers in terms of the benefit system. So people might be aware that there's a limit on benefits for the first 2 children in a child. So if you get the child element of universal credit and you've got 3 children or 4 children, you don't get it for the 3rd or the 4th child. And that's had a massive impact on families with 3 or more children. So nearly half of all families who've got 3 or more children now are living below the poverty line. So government really needs to scrap the 2-child limit, and that's something perhaps that the children's charities, the anti-poverty charities, organisations like ourselves have been most vocal about in recent weeks since Labour came in. But at the moment, that's still in force. We've got this big issue in terms of benefit uptake. So £23 billion worth of benefits are going unclaimed across the UK as a whole. So that includes obviously hundreds of millions of pounds worth of benefits going unclaimed in Greater Manchester. The last government didn't do a huge amount in terms of addressing that issue. And there's definitely things that Department for Work and Pensions and government as a whole could be doing in that space. We need to address this issue of the kind of short-termist approach that we talked about in terms of the household support funds. So ourselves and others are calling for long-term ring-fence funding for local authorities to support residents who are at risk of or experiencing a financial crisis. So moving on from the household support funding fund to something more permanent. And then there's lots that could be done in terms of universal credit. So technical ways in which universal credit operates could be improved to improve outcomes for claimants. we've got a real issue with lots of people who are in receipt of universal credit having deductions on universal credit because they're in some form of debt, often because they've got into debt whilst waiting for their first payment to be made. So there's lots that government could do in that space, which improve things for low income residents across Greater Manchester. I think one of the concerns is we saw winter fuel payments cut this week, so restricted just to those on pension credit. And my sort of concern is that the Treasury is still sort of fixated on the idea that social security spending, which does make up a large proportion of spending by government, is a place where they can still make cuts. And I think government ministers are really going to have to push back against Treasury officials and that kind of, and change that mindset over the coming months and years. So what does this mean for Greater Manchester? And this is just top line, because I think everyone on this call will have their own sort of thoughts and insights into this and what it means for the communities that they work with and support. In Greater Manchester, unfortunately, we have got high levels of poverty and deprivation. We've got some of the areas with highest levels of child poverty in the country. We've got over 600,000 residents in a population of 3 million living below the poverty line. And we have got a high number of people who are in work but reliant on in-work benefits. So they're in low-paying or relatively low-paying work. Got real issues in terms of housing needs across the city region. And as John's touched on, we've got this issue with kind of low-quality jobs. And there is a prevalence and has been a growth of jobs in certain low-paying sectors in Greater Manchester over recent years. So we've had lots of jobs growth, kind of technical jobs, well-paying jobs, but we've also had a lot of jobs growth in kind of care-related roles, which unfortunately are typically kind of lower paid. We've got poor health outcomes in the city region, so we tend to do worse than comparable city regions in other parts of the country on a number of health indicators. We've got challenges around transport connectivity. So I think John mentioned this, but we've got parts of the city region where there are jobs and opportunities, but transport connectivity to those places from across different districts isn't always as good as it should be. So there's lots of connectivity into the city centre. But if you're trying to get from Bury to Trafford Park, how easy a journey is that? And then we've got the real intersection with inequalities. So when we talk about poverty and people experiencing low incomes, we know that certain groups of certain communities within Greater Manchester are disproportionately impacted. We saw that really come through strongly during the pandemic, where kind of low income and ethnicity or low income and other equalities characteristics intersected, and those groups did face poorer outcomes during that period. So quite top level, some of these things we do go into more detail in some of the training that we deliver. So these are courses that people need to book onto. But we do go into some of the issues that we've discussed in a lot of detail over either half a day or a full day. So do have a look at the Resolve Poverty website for more details on those. Or get in touch with me. My email's there, graham@resolvepoverty.org. Always happy to kind of have a chat and respond to you, or ask someone in the team to get back to you if you've got any questions. But hope that was useful, and look forward to hearing people's questions over the next 15 minutes.
Thank you to both John and Graham for sharing your insights. A lot of information there to take in, and I'm sure it's kind of sinking in for people. So whilst you have a minute, folks, to think of any questions that you might want to ask, Claire has kicked us off. So Claire, thank you, from Oxfam GB, has got a question for you, John. What are your views regarding further financialisation, did quite well with that, of and therefore money lost to public services under Labour, or PFI2, with regards particularly to the National Wealth Fund and GBNG? And there's a very useful link in there, but I assume you don't have time to look at that just now, John, but I don't know if you have any initial thoughts, and of course Graham and May as well.
I've got to be careful of not doing another 15-minute presentation at this point.
Oh, okay.
I do have thoughts about this. So I think there's always a risk in terms of how you manage private finance. I think we saw under the new Labour government with PFI that bringing in private finance to do some things actually wasn't always a bad thing. It helps make sure your costs of you, and it brings more money in.
You're allowed to wear shorts at work.
There we go. Whereas there are attempts where they financialize services and they turn services into financial products, and that was really bad because it's very hard to manage that stuff. But I think there's a real problem in that if the government are putting £7 billion down and they're getting 21 billion from the private sector, and the returns on that investment are shared with both the government and the private sector, it's a better position because you've got the investment in, you've got the thing you wanted, and the public purse is gaining some of the benefits. The risk is sometimes when government puts the money down, takes the risks, and all the returns are going to the private sector, and that happened with some of the PFI work. I'm just putting something in chat. There's a link to an academic article by an academic called Daniela Gabor, who's done a lot of work into this and how the state can take the risk and reduce the risk, whereas the private investment makes the return. It doesn't have to be that way. The returns and the risk can be shared. What should be happening with some of this stuff is because the government is putting some money into the process, it's saying to the private sector, we're not going to abandon this. We're going to make sure this works. We make sure the regulations, we're not going to walk away from it. And I think we really need to recognise that when Rishi Sunak cancelled HS2, that really damaged the UK's reputation as a place to invest in, because lots of people had started to invest between Birmingham and Manchester in new businesses. And I remember lots of people in the Chamber of Commerce getting very, very upset about it because they'd just spent years trying to get businesses to locate in Manchester because of the HS2. And nobody would trust the UK again after that. So I think there are issues where the government putting money down is good. It makes us more stable, a better place. But the balance is, are we as the public purse taking the risks and the private sector taking the profit, or is it being balanced and shared equally? We won't know until we see the detail, but that certainly is a risk.
Graham, did you have anything you wanted to add on that, or shall I move along to the next
No, I think
question?
John's covered that.
Wonderful. Okay, so Chris from Unlimited Potential has not directed this question at either of you in particular, so you can arm wrestle for this one. And Adrian has kind of given a follow-on comment to this as well, with some additional context. So from Chris, within the context that has been described, what might be the implications of and opportunities from Labour's manifesto commitment to support diverse business models that bring innovation and new products to the market? This includes the cooperative sector, and Labour has committed to aim to double the size of the UK's cooperative and mutuals sector. Graham or John, do either of you feel
After you, John.
I'll
come in.
So
thank you.
I think the problem is we're not seeing the money behind this, and we'll know in the budget, and we're not seeing necessarily legislation behind it. At the moment, it's a kind of wish and a hope and a dream until we actually start seeing some mechanisms. But I do think it is necessary. So, for example, if you go to somewhere like France, Spain, the social economy is about 10% of the whole economy. A little bit lower in Germany, but not much, about 8%. In the UK, it's about 2%. And too much of that is about using public funding and grant funding to deliver public services. We've not got a lot of kind of community-owned trading to the same degree as elsewhere. Bearing in mind that France has it so large because large wine cooperatives exist, and there's some very rich farmers making some money through those. So there is a clear need to grow the kind of cooperative sector in the social economy. I think the support seems to be so far left at a local level because we've seen it in terms of the mayor backing the our business, the new model for the inclusive ownership approach, but it's not a vast amount of money that's being put in to support the growth of new things there. So I think there's definitely a desire to see it happen and a wish. I think what we don't see is the mechanisms and whether that's going to be built into a standard model of employment support, specialist employment support. Is it going to be a boost for investment in the social investment sector that can actually blend grant and loan to make it more affordable and more likely? So I think there's a whole set of issues there. And I don't think we see it as one of the government's priorities in the first 2 years. We'll perhaps see that over time.
Yeah, I think, well, as Chris knows, it's an area that's always been beset by wishful thinking, and it's seen as a nice to have, isn't it? And we're a long way from getting to the kind of the mix of the economy that we see in other countries in terms of the size of the social sector. So yeah, my sense on that is, as John says, there isn't necessarily the financial backing or the concrete kind of backing from government in terms of how that would maybe make growth in that area happen. I think, as Adrian said in the chat there, also thinking about kind of scaling up what's already there, and that's really where central government can make the biggest difference, because they've got the clout to do that. Localities and metro mayoral areas, can be good in terms of generating some like grassroots activity, but scaling up what's already there feels like a big part of it, and that's where central government should be playing a big role.
Brilliant. Okay, social housing question next from Beatty. So, are there any indicators that there will be any significant additions to affordable social housing, including improving rolling back on right to buy and short-term use only?
Well, we're stuck with right to buy, aren't we, for now? And there was a bit more conversation before the election about tightening up right to buy and doing something about it, but it's as far as I'm aware, unless they've said something that I've missed it, we're stuck with it. I think the issue probably for the housing providers is actually their ability to build and create more stock and more supply, and some of the challenges facing housing providers across Greater Manchester, but across the country as a whole, probably aren't fully understood by central government. I'm not sure policies in place that have been able to kind of respond to those challenges yet. So there's some real issues coming down the track in terms of the ability of local authorities and housing providers to actually provide good quality, affordable accommodation, and to increase the supply of that. So again, it does feel like we're going back to a bit of a recurring theme here in terms of we've got different levels of kind of policy thinking against these different areas. So some policy areas that are really important, where the Labour Party has developed their thinking. But I think the recurring theme is kind of what's the funding to back that. And across a lot of these areas, including supporting housing providers to build more, there is kind of a funding kind of question and issue that the government's going to have to face up to at some point. But no, not necessarily an indication at the moment that they've realised that is as big an issue as it is, or made it a priority.
Thank you, Graham. Just checking, John, if
Yeah,
you wanted to add anything to that.
The thing I'd add to that is the building industry built about 230,000 homes last year, and it's got the workforce to build 230,000 homes. By saying it's going to build 300,000 homes, it will need to massively increase its recruitment. I think they recruit about 6,000 staff a year nationally. That'd have to go up to 17,000 a year. They'd have to more than double the number of people they're recruiting. And then we're getting back into labour market issues and who's going to do this work. I think for a lot of areas where the government's saying we need to do something like this, the question is, where's the workforce? Who's going to be employed to do this? I think there's certainly talk about those targets that an increasing percentage of it will be social housing, and an increasing amount of demand for new planning permission will be affordable housing, but creating the space for social housing to be part of that. I think that will kind of bring down land values because it'll be less profitable to private developers, and that might help reduce some of the ingoing cost and make social housing a bit more viable. So I think I would think we will see more social housing. The question is whether it's sufficient. And it becomes the issue. But I think there's a big issue in, as I say, in who's going to build them.
We have another question from Tom. Charities and social enterprises have been responding to many of the challenges in society and doing so really well. Here, Tom. Does the government have any commitment to look into the third sector more for social solutions? One thing I often see as a challenge is the short-term funding to long-term solutions in our sector. Can you start us off, John?
I was almost tempted to throw that to you, Dawn, as a chief executive of a local support organisation. I think I don't think short-term funding is bad if it's predictable short-term funding. I get that point, Tom. Now it's about short-term funding for long-term issues, and I think what we've got to think about is how do we get money in the right organisations? And I think just going back to that point that Chris raised about the cooperative sector and growing the social economy side of things, if we as organisations can generate returns that we can then put into some of those solutions. So, for example, we've recently lent money to Talk Listen Change, a counselling charity that are building a trading arm that will trade nationally, but that will bring money in to help them subsidise some of their costs and some of their services in Greater Manchester. It's not going to be the route for every organisation, but I think finding different and independent ways to fund, so we're not always reliant on that kind of public funding, becomes quite important. And that's why having business support and an ability to get approaches where some of those organizations can get a steady sense of income that they control, assets that they own, that they can generate the return on. So the return isn't leaving Greater Manchester, but can be reused for social purposes. I think that's where some of the solutions, it's not going to be all of them. And I think we've got to look at the way we commission public services. Rather than actually commissioning public services, it's sometimes about getting the public sector to invest in existing community service and community assets to build on what's there. So I think there needs to be some views on that. But I think we as a sector need to try and think about, well, what about the income we can generate that we can own and control and divert to addressing those rather than trying to always argue with the public sector for a chunk of money that's come through tax. But it's going to be a balance with all these things.
Yeah, I think and I think the sector, there's a couple of things really in terms of that. I think the sector nationally, and I do mean nationally, some of the national bodies that represent the sector could be better in terms of lobbying on behalf of the large community sector and faith organisations in this space. It was a shame Thangam Debbonaire lost the seat because I think she was someone, if she hadn't, she would have been in the cabinet and understood some of the nuance within this area in a way that perhaps some politicians don't. She had a background in the sector, and it's something I'd heard her speak about in a way that suggested she understood the detail of the challenge. John's absolutely right in terms of like mixed business models. So we're not wholly reliant on public sector funding or not wholly reliant on funding from trusts and foundations. So that mix is really important. I also think kind of what's happened in terms of like the anti-poverty space, particularly during the pandemic and cost of living crisis, but it predates that actually, going back to 2010, is voluntary community sector organisations have been very much pulled into firefighting at a local level, firefighting some of the consequences of national government policy, so austerity and things that have happened subsequently. And that's often perhaps best embodied by the growth of food banks that we've seen across communities, across Greater Manchester and across the whole country. That is really, stepping in, providing that crisis response work. And that's really valuable, really needed. But I do think the sector also needs to be very clear with the public sector that that's not its only role and not how it adds value. We're not just there to provide crisis response services on the cheap or relatively cheaper than the public sector can deliver them. And getting that message across kind of locally, regionally, and nationally is something I think we all need to be doing. So there is something about the way the sector advocates for itself that I think is really important in this space, but it's really important locally and regionally as well as a national level.
Thank you both. And Adrian in the chat has added there are some potential green shoots emerging with regards to community health and initial movements happening under the NHS Place agenda and strategy. Thank you for that, Adrian. Okay, we've come to the end of the questions. So you've got a minute for folks who might be sitting on something that they want to ask. Please do in these last few moments. If you have anything that you think would be useful to share equally, some people have helpfully started to put some links into the chat in response to what John and Graham have shared. Please do add those as well, because we will share those links along with the recording of this session and the slides that both John and Graham have shared. So I think we've come to the end of people's questions. Thank you to John and to Graham for helping set the scene and trigger some thinking there. And of course, thank you to everybody for being with us and engaging in this really important subject.